The voicemail came while I was stringing lights across the banister, snow falling steady outside my window. Lena, my mother's voice, said, clipped and careful, about Christmas dinner this year. Your father and I think it might be best if you sat this one out. Everyone's still adjusting to, well, your situation, and we'd rather avoid any awkwardness. Please understand. The message ended with the faint clink of her teacup, that same sound I grew up hearing every morning, calm and detached. I stood there, the garland slipping from my hand, watching the blinking red light on the phone like it might start bleeding. My 7-year-old daughter Emma was in the living room humming Silent Night while cutting paper snowflakes. My son Jack chased our cat under the half-decorated tree. I took a slow breath, pressed delete, and poured myself a glass of red wine. The reflection in the kitchen window showed a woman who'd just been erased from her own family's holiday picture. Apparently, Mommy ruins Christmas now, I muttered. And for the first time all season, the silence actually felt warm. It wasn't like I hadn't expected something like this. Ever since my divorce, my parents had treated me like a public relations disaster waiting to happen. To them, being a divorced woman in our family was worse than being a criminal. It meant failure, gossip, questions they didn't want to answer over cranberry sauce. My mother, Carol Carter, believed appearances were a religion. She polished our family image the way some people polish silver every year before the holidays. When she said, "We just want to keep things peaceful," what she really meant was, "Don't bring your shame into my dining room." I called her back anyway. "Mom," I said when she answered, "I got your message." "Oh, good. I'm glad you understand, sweetheart. It's not personal." It feels personal when you uninvite your own daughter from Christmas. We're trying to protect you from uncomfortable questions. The Dawsons will be there and you know how they gossip. It's just better this way. Better for who? For everyone. You and the children can make your own little tradition. Maybe go skiing, something cheerful. She sounded like she was suggesting a spa treatment, not cutting her daughter out of the family holiday. When I hung up, I found Emma standing in the doorway holding a paper star. "Grandma doesn't want us to come?" she asked. I crouched down and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "No, honey. Grandma just wants a different Christmas this year." "Did we do something bad?" I swallowed hard. "No, we're going to have our own Christmas. Just us. The best one ever." Jack, who'd been listening, grinned. "Can we still have hot cocoa and sing songs?" "Even better," I said, forcing a smile. "We'll have our own feast. Maybe even build a snowman taller than the tree." After they went back to their crafts, I sat at the table staring at the box of ornaments I'd been avoiding opening. Each one was a memory. Tiny glass angels from my grandmother, the porcelain ballerina my mom gave me when I was 10, the baby's first Christmas snow globe from when Emma was born. I realized that, for years, Christmas had been less about joy and more about performing. Smiling for photos, pretending we were the perfect family. My ex-husband Eric would sit beside me at those dinners, all charm and cologne, while my parents beamed like hosts of a live broadcast. Nobody knew that behind closed doors, he was lying cheating, slowly draining me of both love and savings. Now I was the scandal, the divorced daughter, the proof that Carol Carter's perfect family had cracks. I could almost hear her rehearsing excuses for the neighbors. Lena just needed time to herself this year. She's focusing on the children. Anything but the truth. I poured another glass of wine and scrolled through my phone, half out of habit, half searching for distraction. Photos of other families flooded my feed, matching pajamas, coordinated red sweaters, smiling husbands holding babies by fireplaces. For a moment I felt that familiar sting of envy, then something else, defiance. Why did their approval still matter to me? Why did I still crave an invitation to a table where I was only welcome if I kept my pain invisible? The next morning I woke up early. The house was quiet except for the sound of the heater humming against the cold. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, intending to look up recipes for Christmas cookies. Instead, I found myself clicking through listings for houses I couldn't possibly afford, or so I thought. Big stone homes tucked into snowy mountainsides, fireplaces the size of my old bedroom chandeliers dripping with light. It was a dangerous kind of daydreaming. Then I saw it, a restored Victorian estate in Aspen. Wide verandas, 12-foot ceilings, a grand staircase, and in the listing photos a massive Christmas tree glittering in gold. Available immediately, it said. For a full minute I stared at the screen. The price was ridiculous, but the idea wasn't. I wasn't thinking about revenge yet, not exactly. What I felt was something sharper, colder. A hunger to reclaim my story. If my family thought I was too broken, too divorced, too inconvenient for their perfect holiday image, maybe it was time to build one of my own. By evening, I'd printed the listing and pinned it to the fridge right next to Emma's drawing of a snowman family. My kids came running in from the snow cheeks, pink eyes bright. "Mommy, are we really having our own Christmas?" Emma asked. "We are," I said, "and it's going to be beautiful." "How beautiful?" Jack asked. I smiled. The kind of Christmas people talk about for years. When they went to bed, I sat by the window with a blanket, watching the snow fall heavier, now burying everything in silence. The neighborhood lights shimmered against the white, each house glowing like a postcard. Somewhere in Denver, my family was probably sitting in their polished living room discussing seating charts and color themes. My mother would be ironing the tablecloth, my father checking the wine cellar, my sister-in-law arranging poinsettias around the silver candlesticks. All perfect, all hollow. My phone buzzed on the counter, a new voicemail from my brother Mark. "Hey Lena, Mom told me about dinner. Don't take it personally, okay? You know how she is about appearances." Then a pause. "Maybe next year." Next year. The phrase tasted bitter. I deleted that message too. Then I opened my laptop again, clicked on the Aspen listing, and stared at the photographs until I could almost hear the echo of laughter in those wide, empty halls. A part of me whispered, "You can't afford this." Another voice, louder, said, "You can't afford to keep living like they get to decide your worth." I shut the laptop and looked toward the half-decorated tree. The lights blinked unevenly, one strand flickering out. I walked over, fixed the bulb, and whispered to the empty room. "If they want perfect, I'll show them perfect." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, relentless, clean. And for the first time in years, I felt something like peace. Not the kind you beg for, but the kind you create yourself. The kind that starts with a quiet promise: this Christmas, no one would make me feel small again. Last Christmas, everything still looked perfect from the outside. The Carter family's annual holiday dinner could have been a magazine spread, red velvet ribbons on the staircase, polished, crystal-matching sweaters. My mother floated around the dining room, giving orders in her soft, controlling tone, and my father poured wine as if nothing in the world had ever gone wrong. And there I was, standing in the kitchen, elbow deep in cookie dough, pretending not to notice, my husband texting someone under the table. "Smile, Lena," my mother said, straightening the bow on my dress before I carried out the pies. "You have everything a woman could want." I smiled for her camera because that was what I'd been trained to do. Smile. Look grateful. Keep the peace. Behind me, Eric laughed too loudly at something my brother said, his phone lighting up again with another message. I remember watching his reflection in the window, the way his fingers hovered too long before typing. The sound of Christmas carols faded, replaced by that cold electric hum of suspicion. Even then, I think I knew. I just didn't want to admit it. I had built my life around that man, around the idea of us. If I had admitted the cracks, the whole thing would have shattered, and with it, the version of me my parents wanted to show the world. By March, the cracks weren't cracks anymore. They were chasms. Eric was always late, coming home smelling of cologne. I didn't recognize his shirt, still warm from someone else's hands. He told me he had new patients, emergency surgeries, a growing practice. "It's good for the business," he said. "Be proud of me." I wanted to believe him, but the clinic schedule didn't match his stories. Appointments appeared under names I didn't know, repeated names, same times, same days. One night, I packed dinner and drove to his office. The parking lot was empty except for his car, and one other, a shiny red convertible I'd never seen before. The front lights of the clinic were off, but I saw shadows moving inside. I pushed open the glass door quietly, my heels echoing in the silence. Through the half-closed blinds, I saw Eric standing too close to his dental assistant, his hand on the small of her back. They were laughing softly, and something about the intimacy in that laughter hit harder than any confession could have. I didn't burst in. I didn't scream. I walked out, sat in my car, and watched the snow start to fall. When I got home, he was already there, pretending to work on billing reports. "Where were you?" he asked without looking up. "I could ask you the same thing I said," he sighed dramatically. "You're imagining things again, Lena. You've been fragile lately. Since you stopped teaching, you've had too much time to think." That was his favorite trick, making me doubt myself. Gaslighting, though I didn't have a word for it back then. Every lie came wrapped in concern, every betrayal disguised as my overreaction. By the end of that night, I almost apologized for making him uncomfortable. Almost. A week later, the truth started leaking through in the most boring, bureaucratic way possible: an email from the bank. Account overdue. Immediate attention required. At first I thought it was spam. But then I saw the balance: zero. Our joint savings drained. When I confronted him, Eric's face twisted into annoyance, not guilt. "I moved the money temporarily," he said. "Investment purposes. You wouldn't understand the financial side of the business." "Then explain it to me," I said. "It's complicated," he muttered, grabbing his coat. "Don't worry about it." But I did worry. I dug through files, tax returns, business receipts. What I found didn't make sense. Rent payments to non-existent companies' equipment, purchases for phantom offices, checks signed over to consultants I'd never met. He was hiding money, maybe hiding more than that. When I told my father, hoping for guidance, he just sighed and rubbed his temples. "Lena, this isn't the time to make a scene. Marriage takes patience. You have children to think about. Dad, he's lying to me. He's stealing from me. You're angry, and that's understandable. But divorce," he said the word like it was profanity. "That would hurt everyone's reputation." Reputation, that sacred word in our house, the invisible God we all served. "Reputation over truth," I said. "That's the family motto, isn't it?" He looked away. When I walked out of my parents' house that night, the air felt heavy and cold. I remember thinking that if I stopped moving, the weight of it all would crush me right there on their perfect front porch. The next morning, I packed 2 suitcases, grabbed the kids, and left. Emma was 6, then still asking when Daddy would come home. Jack clutched his stuffed bear and said, "Are we going on vacation?" I told him yes, because the truth we're leaving forever was too much for his small heart. We moved into a small apartment with beige walls and a heating unit that rattled. I thought maybe my mother would visit, bring soup, tell me she was proud of me for standing up for myself. Instead, she showed up 2 days later with a tray of casseroles and a lecture. "Men make mistakes," she said, glancing around my modest living room as if poverty were contagious. "Don't throw away your marriage over pride." "He lied to me," I said. "He took our money." She smoothed her gloves, avoiding my eyes. "Then forgive him quietly. People don't need to know the details." "People already do, Mom. You just care that they know." Her lips tightened. "You always were dramatic. Think of the children, Lena. They need stability. Stability doesn't come from pretending." That was the last thing I said before she left. The door closed softly, but it sounded like a verdict. A week later, my brother Daniel called. "I heard about you and Eric," he said, voice full of pity and something colder. "You need to be practical. You can't raise 2 kids alone. Watch me." He chuckled, the same condescending laugh I remembered from childhood. "Mom and Dad are worried. You're making things harder than they need to be." Harder for who? For everyone. Families are supposed to stick together. I wanted to scream that they were the ones who'd untied the knot, that I was the only one holding the threads together. But what was the point? They didn't hear me then, and they weren't going to start now. By April, the divorce papers were drafted. Eric's lawyer sent a smug email filled with legal jargon and veiled threats. Our client wishes to settle amicably, it read, which I learned was code for take what we offer and shut up. He offered me the car and a small monthly payment, barely enough to cover groceries. I stared at the numbers until my vision blurred. Then I closed the laptop, poured myself coffee, and whispered no. That night, after the kids fell asleep, I sat by the window in that little apartment, watching the lights from the street flicker through the blinds. I thought about how many years I'd spent keeping quiet, so everyone else could be comfortable. I had mistaken silence for grace, endurance for love. My mother called it keeping the peace. But peace, I realized, shouldn't feel like suffocation. I picked up my phone and typed an email to a name I'd found earlier that day, Patricia Lang, a divorce attorney, recommended by a friend from college. I didn't write a long message, just I'm ready to file, I need help. Before I could talk myself out of it, I hit send. I took off my wedding ring that night. It left a pale mark on my finger, a ghost of the woman I used to be. I set it on the table beside an untouched cup of tea and turned off the light. Through the window, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft, quiet, relentless. I stood there for a moment, watching it cover the world in white, and for the first time in months, I felt something almost like calm. Not happiness, not yet, but the beginning of something else. A decision. A promise to myself that the next time I smiled, it wouldn't be for anyone's camera. It would be because I meant it. The courthouse doors closed behind me with a sound that felt final, like the heavy lid of a box being sealed. The sky above Denver was steel gray, the kind that warned of snow. I stood on the steps, clutching a manila envelope full of papers, my divorce decree, my settlement documents, proof that 5 years of marriage could be reduced to a stack of signatures and embossed stamps. It was over, and yet I'd never felt more uncertain about what came next. The wind cut through my coat as I walked to the car. I'd parked 3 blocks away because I couldn't afford the garage fee. Inside, the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and crayons. Jack had left his drawing on the back seat. A stick figure family. Just the 3 of us, now smiling under a crooked Sunday. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and breathed in the silence. For the first time, there was no one to tell me what to do next, no safety net disguised as control. Just me, 2 kids, and a balance in my checking account that wouldn't last the month. That night, after I tucked the kids into bed, I logged into our old joint account and froze. It was locked. Eric had moved the remaining funds to a business escrow. The landlord's notice sat unopened on the counter, rent overdue. I stared at the bills spread out like a losing hand in a card game and wondered how everything had collapsed so quickly. Emma padded into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. "Mommy, does this mean Daddy's not coming back?" she asked. I managed a smile I didn't feel. "No, honey. It means we get to make our own story now." The next few weeks were a blur of decline. I sold my engagement ring, then the SUV we'd bought for the family. I found a cheaper apartment in an aging building across town, the kind with thin walls and humming pipes. Our new place smelled of dust and detergent, but it was ours, or at least it would be until I ran out of savings. The first night there, the heater broke. I remember curling up on the couch with both kids, wrapping them in the same blanket, whispering stories about polar bears so they'd think the cold was an adventure. The next morning, I knocked on the superintendent's door, hoping for repairs, but no one answered. Instead, I met the woman from the apartment next to ours. She was in her early 60s with a gray braid and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything but still found reasons to smile. "You must be the new tenant," she said, handing me a wrench. "Name's Maggie. You'll need this more than the landlord's number." I laughed for the first time in weeks. She helped me tighten a pipe under the sink, then stayed for coffee. She told me she used to be an art teacher before retiring, that she'd lost her husband 3 years ago, and her son barely spoke to her now. "Family's funny that way," she said, stirring sugar into her mug. "They disappear when you need them, then reappear when they need you." Something in her tone hit home. We talked for hours that day about everything from favorite painters to the loneliness of starting over. Before she left, she placed her hand on mine. "You'll be fine, Lena. You've still got that spark, don't let them snuff it out. Over the next month, Maggie became my lifeline. She'd knock on my door with leftover soup or bring the kids coloring books she found at the thrift store. Sometimes she'd just sit at my table sipping tea, filling the silence with stories about the students she once taught. There was a steadiness in her presence that reminded me what kindness sounded like when it didn't come with conditions. Meanwhile, I started searching for work again. Teaching jobs were scarce mid-year, but the community center downtown needed someone to run weekend art classes for children. The pay was modest, barely enough to cover groceries, but the idea of picking up a brush again stirred something in me. I hadn't painted in years. Eric used to complain about the mess, the smell of turpentine, the useless hobby. I'd packed away my paints the way people bury dreams they can't afford to keep. The first day of class, I walked into a room filled with mismatched easels and bright-eyed kids clutching cheap paint sets. They called me Miss Lena, and within minutes the room buzzed with laughter and color. A little girl named Sophie asked if she could paint the sky purple. "You can paint it any color you want," I told her. "It's your world." And as I said it, I realized I was talking to myself too. By the end of that first class, my hands were stained with blue and gold, my hair smelled like acrylic, and for the first time since the divorce, I didn't feel broken. I felt alive. Days turned into weeks. Between teaching and part-time online tutoring, I managed to pay the bills. Maggie helped me fix things around the apartment. The kids adjusted better than I'd dared to hope. Emma started leaving little notes on the fridge. "Mom, your smile looks good today." Jack asked if we could paint his room yellow because it feels happy. Slowly, the cracks in our lives filled with new color. One evening, Maggie invited me over for dinner. Her apartment was filled with paintings, wild, messy, beautiful strokes of color. "You still paint?" I asked. "Every day," she said. "You should too. It's how you survive the noise." She handed me an old sketchbook and a set of brushes she didn't use anymore. That night, after the kids fell asleep, I opened it and began to draw. At first, the lines trembled, uncertain, like I'd forgotten how to move my hand that way. But soon the motion returned. I painted a tree covered in snow, its branches bending but not breaking. I didn't notice the tears on my cheeks until they mixed with the watercolor. The next morning, I hung the painting on our living room wall. Maggie came by, looked at it, and said softly, "That's not sadness, honey, that's strength." By spring, the community center offered me more hours. I started organizing weekend exhibits for the kids, small displays where parents could admire their children's art. I saw myself in those little faces, hopeful, messy, determined. Each time they cheered for one another, I felt a piece of the woman I used to be returning stronger, sharper. It wasn't all easy. Some nights loneliness crept in like a draft through the window. Bills still scared me. The absence of family still hurt, but I'd stopped waiting for rescue. I was learning that independence wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing up again, even when your knees were shaking. One Friday evening after class, I walked home through falling snow. The streetlights cast long golden reflections on the pavement. I passed a store window filled with Christmas decorations, red ornaments, wreaths, and a tall white tree glowing in the display. For a second, I thought of my parents' house, the one I wasn't welcome in anymore, and then of Maggie's voice in my head, "Family isn't always who you're born to, it's who shows up." When I got home, the kids were asleep on the couch, a half-built gingerbread house between them. I covered them with a blanket, sat beside them, and looked around the little apartment. It wasn't much, but it was ours, built from resilience and second chances. Maggie stopped by the next morning with cinnamon rolls and a grin. "You've got that glow again," she said, handing me coffee. "That's the look of a woman coming back to life." I laughed, touched my cheek, and realized she was right. For the first time, my reflection didn't look like someone's daughter or ex-wife. It looked like me. That night, as the snow fell quietly outside, I stood at the window holding my mug and thought about everything. I'd lost my home, my marriage, my family's approval. And yet what filled the space they left wasn't emptiness. It was something steadier, something mine. Maybe losing everything wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning of who I was always meant to be. The first time I met Patricia Lang, I almost turned around at her office door. The law firm was in a converted brick townhouse near downtown Denver, all polished wood and the faint smell of coffee and toner. I stood there, clutching my folder of documents like a student waiting outside the principal's office. Then a voice called out, firm, but not unkind. "You must be Lena Carter." Patricia was in her early 50s, sharp gray bob glasses perched low on her nose. Everything about her said competence. The neat stack of files, the small cactus on her desk that looked impossible to kill the steady way she studied me. "You've been underestimated, haven't you?" she said before I could sit down. I blinked, unsure how to answer. "I suppose you could say that," she smiled faintly. "I usually can tell. Start from the beginning. Leave nothing out." For the next hour, I talked until my throat ached about Eric, about the affair, about the missing money, the frozen bank accounts. The way my family acted like silence was more valuable than truth. Patricia didn't interrupt. She took notes, occasionally asking a precise question, her pen tapping lightly against the pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "He's hiding assets," she said simply. "They always do." My hands tightened around the folder. "Can we prove it?" "Oh, I can prove anything," she said, with a calm that made me believe her. "But I'll need time and a forensic accountant." She slid a business card across the desk. "We'll find every penny he tried to bury." For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt a flicker of something close to safety. Someone was finally on my side. The investigation began quietly, almost clinically. Patricia's office became my second home. I'd sit across from her desk, surrounded by stacks of paper, while her team combed through years of Eric's financial records. There were spreadsheets, invoices, and receipts coded with abbreviations that might as well have been hieroglyphics. Patricia explained them all with surgical precision. "Here's where it gets interesting," she said one afternoon, pointing to a column of payments labeled equipment upgrades. "This vendor doesn't exist. The address is a mailbox at a UPS store." I stared at the printout. "So he's been funneling money. Looks that way." "And here, consulting fees to someone named Brittany Summers." My stomach turned. His assistant. Patricia arched an eyebrow. "Well, she's certainly consulting him on something." I couldn't help the small laugh that escaped me. It felt wrong laughing about any of it, but it also felt good. Patricia grinned just a little. "Don't worry. Humor's how we stay sane in this line of work." Weeks passed. The more her team uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Eric wasn't just dishonest, he was creative. Shell companies, inflated expenses, false equipment purchases. Patricia's accountant traced every trail of money like a detective following footprints in fresh snow. "He's not just lying to you, Lena," Patricia said one evening as she flipped through another report. "He's lying to the IRS. That's leverage." The word leverage hung in the air like a promise. 2 weeks later, Eric called. "Let's talk," he said, his voice too smooth. "No lawyers, just us." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet. We chose a coffee shop halfway between our apartment's neutral ground, though nothing about that day felt neutral. He was already seated when I arrived, dressed in one of his expensive coats, his smile rehearsed. "You look good," he said, as if we were old friends catching up. "I didn't come here for compliments." He stirred his coffee slowly, eyes sharp behind the charm. "I think we both know this divorce doesn't need to get ugly. You don't want to drag it out, Lena. It'll just make you look bitter." I watched him for a moment, then reached into my purse and pulled out a printed document Patricia had given me. It wasn't the real evidence, just a summary. I slid it across the table. "Then let's hope bitterness doesn't show up in the audit reports." His smile faltered. "What is this?" "Just a few things you forgot to mention in your disclosures. You might want to call your lawyer." He opened his mouth to argue, but I was already standing. "You can get this," I said, tapping the paper, "or we can get everything. Your choice." As I walked out, I realized I wasn't shaking. I wasn't afraid. The cold air hit my face, and for once it felt clean. A few days later, Patricia called me back to her office. "We've found something big," she said the moment I sat down. She pushed a folder toward me. Inside were pages of transactions transfers from Eric's dental practice to a personal account under his mother's name. Every month for 3 years, Patricia said. And look at this property deed for a downtown apartment he claimed was storage space. I flipped through the photos. The apartment was modern, fully furnished, and definitely not for storage. "So, that's where they've been meeting," I murmured. Patricia nodded. "He's made it very easy for us. When this goes to mediation, we'll have him cornered." My head swam. There was anger, yes, but beneath it something else: relief. Proof that I hadn't imagined it. That I wasn't the crazy, ungrateful wife my family painted me to be. Patricia leaned forward. "You played by the rules, Lena. He didn't. That's why we'll win." That night I drove home in silence, snow beginning to fall again. I parked outside the apartment building and sat there for a while, watching the flakes drift in the streetlight. Maggie must have seen the headlights because she appeared at my window holding a thermos. "Hot chocolate," she said, handing it to me. "You look like you've got something to celebrate." "I do," I said, smiling faintly. "He's finally getting caught." She laughed, that low, warm laugh of hers. "Good. About time karma did its job." I went upstairs and tucked the kids into bed. Emma asked if we could make snow angels tomorrow. "Sure," I said, kissing her forehead. "We'll make the biggest ones we can." And for the first time, the future didn't look like a storm I had to survive. It looked like open sky. But not everyone shared my relief. Word of the financial investigation spread faster than I expected. My mother called one evening while I was preparing lesson plans. Her voice was tight, brittle. "Lena, must you make this public? People are starting to talk." I set down my pen. "Then maybe they should talk about what he did, not what I'm doing." "You're making a spectacle of yourself," she said, dragging the family name through the mud. "Mom, he stole from me. He lied. Why are you more worried about his reputation than my life? You could handle this privately." "I tried that," I said. "You told me to stay quiet." My father took the phone then. His voice was softer but not warmer. "We can't afford scandal, Lena. Not with our friends, our business connections." I cut him off. "I can't afford silence." The line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, the dial tone humming like an old wound reopening. Then I laughed quietly, almost to myself. I'd been waiting my whole life for their approval, and now I realized how little it was worth. Later that night, I drove through downtown past the glowing storefronts and decorated trees. The radio played "Let It Snow," cheerful and oblivious. I rolled down the window, let the cold air sting my face, and thought about how much had changed in a single year. I wasn't fighting just for money or justice anymore. I was fighting to be believed. The city lights blurred through the snow, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a woman left behind. I felt like someone finally catching up to her own strength. The mediation room smelled like old coffee and tension. I sat beside Patricia at the long oak table, the kind meant to make people feel small. Across from us, Eric straightened his tie, all smug composure and false confidence. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, and he nodded, smirking at me like this was just another performance he was certain he'd win. Patricia didn't bother with small talk. She slid a thick folder onto the table with a quiet thud. "Before we begin," she said, her voice calm and sharp, "I'd like to enter new financial evidence into the record." Eric's smirk faltered. "What is this transparency?" Patricia said. "Something you seem to have misplaced." She opened the folder and spread the pages out: bank statements, wire transfers, property deeds. "Here we have transfers from your business account to your mother's name totaling $280,000. And here," she tapped another page, "payments to a non-existent consulting firm registered at your office assistant's home address." Eric's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "These accusations are unsubstantiated. They're documented," Patricia cut in. "And if you'd like to debate authenticity, we can bring in the federal auditor who verified them." I watched Eric's hands tighten into fists. The color drained from his face as Patricia continued, methodical and relentless. This so-called storage apartment downtown, fully furnished, registered as a business expense. Convenient considering how often you were there after office hours. His voice cracked as he said, "That's not relevant to the financial settlement. It's relevant to your credibility," Patricia replied smoothly. "And I think we both know you've exhausted your supply of that." The mediator cleared her throat, looking exhausted already. "Mr. Dawson, these are serious discrepancies. I recommend you take your counsel's advice before this escalates further." Eric leaned back, jaw tight. "You're trying to humiliate me." "No," I said softly. "You did that yourself." He glared at me, but for once his words didn't land. He was unraveling, and everyone in the room could see it. Patricia closed her folder, satisfaction flickering briefly in her eyes. "Now," she said, "let's discuss settlement terms." The next hour felt surreal. Numbers bounced across the table like tennis balls: alimony, property value, restitution. Eric kept insisting his practice was struggling, but every lie was followed by Patricia producing another piece of proof to the contrary. Finally, the mediator sighed. "Given the evidence, I suggest an equitable split of assets, including compensation for hidden funds." Eric's lawyer leaned in to whisper to him again, but Eric didn't respond. He just stared down at the table, his arrogance finally deflated. When the papers were pushed toward him, he signed them without looking up. Patricia passed the final copy to me. "Congratulations," she said quietly. "You just bought your freedom." The words didn't hit right away. They sank in slowly like warmth after frostbite. I glanced across the table. Eric's hands trembled as he gathered his things. He didn't even meet my eyes. The man who'd once controlled every detail of my life couldn't even control his pen. As we left the building, Patricia turned to me. "You did well in there." I didn't say much. Sometimes silence speaks loudest. Outside, the afternoon light bounced off the snow, almost too bright to look at. For the first time in months, the air felt breathable. I followed Patricia to her car. "What now?" I asked. She handed me a sealed envelope. Inside are your settlement details, accounts, investments, and enough for a substantial new start. What you do next is up to you. I hesitated, running my fingers over the envelope. "What would you do?" Patricia smiled. The kind of smile that hinted she'd survived her own wars. "I'd build something beautiful out of what he tried to destroy." When I got home, Maggie was waiting with 2 cups of coffee and a grin. "So it's done," I said. She raised her mug. "To justice." I laughed. "To peace." Same thing sometimes. That night after the kids went to bed, I opened the envelope. The figures inside didn't feel real: accounts I'd never seen, investments I didn't know existed. Patricia had uncovered everything Eric had tried to hide, and now it was mine. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, but not from fear. This wasn't revenge in the way my family imagined it, loud and dramatic. It was quiet, methodical, dignified. Justice without apology. The next morning, my phone rang. My mother's name flashed on the screen. I almost didn't answer. "Lena," she began, her voice taut. "I heard about the court ruling." "Word travels fast," I said. "You didn't have to humiliate him in public. People are talking. Then maybe they should talk about what he did, not what I survived. You've made this so messy. You could have settled privately." "He drained our accounts, Mom. He lied for years." Her sigh crackled through the line. "You got your money. Isn't that enough?" I laughed softly. "It was never about the money." Then Daniel's voice joined in. He was on speakerphone. "Mom's right, Lena. You've proven your point. Don't drag this out. Dignity is quiet. Maybe that's why none of you ever had any," I said before hanging up. I stared at the phone for a long time. The old me would have felt guilty, desperate to explain, to make them understand. But the woman who'd walked out of that courthouse didn't owe them justification. The world outside my window was blanketed in white. I sat at the kitchen table, papers spread around me like puzzle pieces of a new life. For the first time, possibility didn't scare me. It thrilled me. A week later, I met with a real estate agent Patricia recommended. Something peaceful but with space for the kids, I told her. She showed me a catalog of houses, some modest, some extravagant, but one stopped me cold. A restored colonial mansion in Aspen, sitting at the edge of a snow-covered valley. Its wide veranda was draped in pine garlands, and in the photo, a massive Christmas tree glowed gold in the living room window. This one just went on the market, the agent said. It's been fully renovated. You could move in by winter. I traced the edge of the picture with my finger. It didn't look like a house. It looked like redemption. That night, as the kids and I ate dinner, Emma asked Mommy, "Will we have a Christmas tree this year?" I smiled. "Yes, sweetheart. And it's going to shine brighter than ever." After they went to bed, I sat alone in the quiet apartment, the Aspen photo glowing on my laptop screen. Outside, the snow fell steady and slow, covering the streetlights in a golden haze. I thought of everything my family had said, how I'd ruined our reputation, how I should have stayed quiet. They'd cut me off to protect their image, but I was done shrinking to fit anyone's version of perfection. I folded the photo, slipped it into my wallet, and whispered to the empty room, "You wanted a perfect picture, Mom. Just wait. I'll show you what perfect looks like." The snow kept falling, and somewhere deep inside I could feel the first spark of something dangerous and beautiful, an idea that glittered like gold under the Christmas lights. The drive to Aspen felt like stepping into another world. The city faded behind me, replaced by pine trees blanketed in snow and winding mountain roads that shimmered in the morning sunday. Emma and Jack sat in the back seat, pressed against the windows, pointing at deer tracks and frozen lakes, as if they were seeing magic for the first time. Maggie rode shotgun, humming to an old Christmas tune on the radio, her thermos of coffee steaming in the cold air. When the house came into view, the world seemed to pause. It sat at the base of a slope framed by evergreens, dusted in white, its windows glowing with soft gold light. A wraparound porch, stone chimneys, dark wood doors, it looked like something out of a winter fairy tale. Emma gasped, "Mommy, it looks like a Christmas castle." I pulled over at the end of the long driveway, heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt since childhood. "It's ours," I said, barely above a whisper. For a second, I couldn't move. After everything, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, the lawyers, the loneliness, I was here, not surviving, beginning again. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and vanilla. The floors creaked under my boots as I walked through the foyer. High ceilings, a grand staircase, sunlight streaming through arched windows. The living room had a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, and the kitchen opened out into the woods through wide glass doors. Every corner felt warm, alive. Maggie ran her fingers along the banister and smiled. "You didn't just buy a house, honey. You bought back your peace." The kids raced upstairs, shouting over each other about which bedroom they wanted. I stood in the middle of the empty living room, listening to their laughter echo through the walls. For years, I'd lived in houses built for someone else's comfort. This one finally felt like mine. The next few days were a blur of unpacking and discovery. Each morning, sunlight poured through the windows like liquid gold, waking us gently. I brewed coffee while the kids fed birds on the back deck, their giggles carried on the wind. Maggie helped me hang curtains and pick out furniture. "You need a couch that makes people want to stay a while," she said, insisting we choose the softest one in the store. One afternoon, we found a small shop on Main Street selling Christmas trees. The owner, an older man with red cheeks and a thick wool coat, greeted us cheerfully. "That's a big one," he said as I pointed to the tallest spruce in the lot. "Big family," I smiled. "Bigger than they think." He laughed, and for a moment so did I. We hauled the tree back to the mansion in a borrowed truck. It took nearly an hour just to get it upright, its branches brushing the 12-foot ceiling. The scent of pine filled the air. Emma clapped her hands when we plugged in the first strand of lights. "It's taller than me and Jack together." "Then we'll need twice as many ornaments," I said. We spent the entire evening decorating. Jack hung his handmade snowflakes near the bottom, while Emma climbed the step stool to hang glass globes near the top. Maggie strung gold ribbon in spirals, her hands steady despite the arthritis she never mentioned. When the lights finally flicked on, the whole room glowed in shades of amber and gold. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The fire crackled softly, reflecting off the ornaments like tiny suns. I thought about every Christmas that had come before: stiff smiles, polite conversations, my mother's perfect table settings, the constant feeling that I was performing for approval that never came. This was nothing like that. This was real. "It's perfect," Maggie whispered. I nodded. "It's ours." We baked gingerbread that night, the kids covered in flour and laughter. I played old carols on the speaker, and Maggie joined in, her voice slightly off-key but full of warmth. When I tucked the kids into bed later, Emma asked, "Do you think Grandma will call this year?" I hesitated. Maybe I said softly, "But even if she doesn't, we have everything we need right here." Downstairs, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch watching the lights flicker on the tree. The glow painted the walls in gold and copper, making the house look alive, breathing. For the first time in years, I felt calm. Not the brittle calm of pretending, but the deep, quiet kind that comes from building something with your own hands. A few days later, an email appeared in my inbox, an invitation to the annual Carter Family Charity Gala, the same event my parents had hosted every Christmas for as long as I could remember. My name wasn't on the mailing list anymore, of course. It was a forward from an old family friend, the kind of person who liked to gossip under the guise of concern. I stared at the invitation for a long time. The gala was always my mother's pride and joy, her annual chance to display our perfect family. I could picture it even now: the marble hall, the expensive dresses, the forced laughter. The thought of it made me smile, not from longing but from clarity. Maggie found me at the kitchen table, laptop open, coffee untouched. "Planning something?" she asked, a knowing spark in her eyes. "Just thinking," I said. Dangerous word, that one, she teased. I closed the laptop and looked toward the glowing tree in the living room. "I think it's time I hosted a celebration of my own. Something real. For people who actually deserve it." She grinned. "Now that's the spirit." That night the snow fell thicker, muffling every sound outside. I stood by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching flakes drift down through the golden light spilling from the living room. The house felt alive, humming with quiet anticipation, as if it knew what I was planning before I did. The next morning I started making lists: names, ideas, dishes. Friends from work, neighbors, Maggie's church group, the barista who always slipped me extra cinnamon. I didn't know exactly what the dinner would look like yet, but I knew how it would feel: warm, loud, joyful. The opposite of everything I'd left behind. A few nights later, after the kids had gone to bed, I went outside. The air was crisp and biting, the kind that made your breath sparkle in the cold. I stood on the porch, staring out at the valley. The moonlight caught the snow, turning the ground into a sheet of silver. Behind me, through the wide window, the Christmas tree shone so bright it looked like molten gold spilling into the darkness. I closed my eyes and took a long breath. "They cut me off to protect their perfect image," I whispered. "But I've built something real, and it shines brighter than their lies ever could." When I opened my eyes, a single snowflake landed on my glove, glittering for an instant before melting away. Inside, the tree glowed like a promised gold against the white silence, calling out to the ghosts of my past. And somewhere deep inside me, a quiet certainty began to form. This wasn't just the beginning of a new life. It was the start of something bigger. Something they would never see coming. The idea came to me on a quiet December morning, the kind where the world feels still under a fresh layer of snow. I was drinking coffee at the kitchen table, flipping through local news online, when I saw a photo of my mother and father smiling beneath a crystal chandelier at their annual Christmas gala. The caption read, "The Carters host their traditional charity dinner. Guests praise the family's enduring grace." I almost laughed. Grace. That word had always been their favorite disguise. I looked up at the golden light reflecting off the tree in the corner of the room. My house felt alive, warm, messy, imperfect. And then it hit me. If they could have their perfect dinner, so could I. Only mine wouldn't be for show, mine would be for people who actually deserve joy. I grabbed a notebook and a pen and started writing names. At first it was just Maggie and a few coworkers from the art center. Then I thought of Jessica, my college roommate, who had once cried to me about spending Christmas alone after her divorce. I added her name, then Sarah's another teacher who lived too far from her own family to visit. Before I knew it, my pen was racing down the page. I titled the list simply Christmas Feast. The first call I made was to Jessica. When she answered, her voice sounded small. "Lena, it's been ages, I know," I said. "But I was wondering, what are you doing for Christmas?" She hesitated. "Probably takeout and a movie. The kids are with their dad this year." "How about Aspen instead?" I asked. "A big dinner at my new place. Good food, too much wine, people who won't judge you for wearing pajamas after dessert." There was a pause, then a soft sniffle. "You mean that?" "I mean it." She laughed through tears. "Then I'm in. I'll bring pie." Next was Sarah. She worked in the next town over and usually spent holidays volunteering because, as she put it, it's easier than being alone. When I told her about the feast, she didn't hesitate. "You mean Christmas in Aspen, with an actual tree and everything? I'm packing already." Kevin, the barista from the cafe near my art studio, was next. His family had stopped speaking to him after he came out last year, and I couldn't stand the thought of him spending the holidays pouring lattes for strangers. "Bring your boyfriend," I told him. "And come hungry." He laughed, his voice bright. "You're serious, dead serious. Then I'll make peppermint brownies. They're dangerously addictive." By noon, my kitchen table was covered in sticky notes and phone numbers. I called Mrs. Patterson, the widow who lived 2 doors down. "Oh, I couldn't," she said at first. "I wouldn't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be intruding," I told her. "You'd be honoring us with your presence." There was a long pause before she said quietly, "You'd make my holiday, dear." By the end of the afternoon, I had 29 names. None of them shared my blood, but all of them shared something real: kindness, courage, empathy. The kind of people who showed up when no one else did. Over the next week, my house turned into a small production set. I hired a caterer from Denver, young, ambitious, and thrilled by the idea of hosting a grand feast in the mountains. We planned the menu: heritage turkey with truffle stuffing, maple glazed ham, roasted vegetables with rosemary lobster mac and cheese, and a dessert spread that looked like art. "Theme?" the caterer asked. "Gold and evergreen," I said. "Something that feels alive. Something that says we made it." Maggie helped with the decorations, humming carols while she tied garlands along the staircase. The kids made handmade place cards shaped like stars. Sarah and Jessica arrived early to help polish silverware and fold napkins. The air buzzed with laughter and cinnamon and the soft hum of jazz music drifting from the speakers. One afternoon, as the caterers tested recipes in the kitchen, Maggie turned to me, hands on her hips. "You know what this feels like, what, family?" I smiled, a lump rising in my throat. "Yeah, it does." She nodded. "You're building something special here, honey. Not everyone gets a second chance to do that." Later that night, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in the living room, the only light coming from the fireplace and the tree. I opened a box of blank cards and started writing. One for each guest. "Thank you for showing up. Thank you for proving that kindness can be louder than blood." When I finished the last card, I lined them up along the mantel. My hands smelled of pine and ink, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was thriving. The next day, I finalized the music: live jazz trio, soft and soulful. The florist from town delivered crates of white roses and pine branches. Maggie insisted on overseeing the table settings. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right," she said, arranging candles in golden holders. The house smelled of roasted garlic and sugar cookies, and outside the snow kept falling, thick and silent. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window. The valley below glowed under the moonlight, the mountains towering like silent witnesses. For years, Christmas had meant smiling for photos. I didn't want to take serving food I didn't get to eat until everyone else was done. I remembered my mother's voice. "Keep your shoulders straight, Lena. Guests are watching." Now the only thing watching was the sky. I raised my glass to the reflection in the window, me standing in my own house, surrounded by light. "Here's to the people who stayed," I whispered, "and to the ones who never deserved to." The night before the feast, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch, looking at the tree shimmering in gold. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about creating something beautiful in the space where pain used to live. When the clock struck midnight, I went outside barefoot in the snow, just to feel it burn against my skin. The mountains loomed dark and still, and I felt small in the best way, like part of something vast and forgiving. Morning came wrapped in silver light. I woke to the sound of trucks outside, the caterers arriving, unloading trays of food and polished serving platters. The jazz trio followed soon after, tuning instruments by the window. The house filled with the sound of laughter and clinking dishes, the smell of cinnamon and roast turkey. Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Mommy," she asked, "will Grandma come if she sees our pictures?" I knelt down and brushed a curl from her face. "Maybe," I said, "but this isn't about her anymore." She smiled and ran off to help Jack arrange ornaments on the banister. I stood in the middle of the house, surrounded by movement and joy, and for a moment everything blurred, the sounds, the lights, the laughter. I realized that what I'd built here wasn't just a party, it was proof. Proof that family could be chosen, that love could rebuild what pride had destroyed. A photographer I'd hired for the night arrived early, setting up his equipment. "You want it to look candid or formal?" he asked. "Neither," I said. "Just real." He nodded. "Real's easy. You just have to stop posing." The music swelled, the doorbell rang, and the first guests began to arrive, their cheeks pink from the cold arms full of wine and gifts. The house filled with voices, warmth, and the kind of laughter that comes from people who've earned it. As I looked around the glowing room, the tree, the table, the people, I felt something deep in my chest loosen. Tomorrow I'd post the photos and maybe my family would see. Maybe they'd call. But tonight wasn't about them. It was about this moment, this house, this light that couldn't be faked. And for the first time, I was exactly where I was meant to be. By Christmas Eve, the house felt alive. Snow drifted down in soft sheets outside, and every window glowed like it held a secret. The jazz trio tuned up near the fireplace, the low hum of the bass filling the air, while the caterers moved like clockwork in the kitchen. The smell of roasted turkey, maple-glazed ham, and cinnamon butter filled every corner. Emma and Jack ran down the stairs, their laughter echoing through the high ceilings, as Maggie directed the staff with her usual no-nonsense warmth. I stood at the base of the staircase, adjusting a gold ribbon on the banister, and caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. A green silk dress, hair, loose, a smile that felt real. It had been a long time since I recognized the woman looking back. The first knock came just as the lights dimmed. Jessica stepped inside, shaking snow from her coat, a homemade pie cradled in her hands. "You weren't kidding about a big Christmas," she said, eyes wide at the sight of the tree glittering gold in the corner. "It's like walking into a dream." "Stay long enough and you'll realize it's real," I said, taking her coat. Sarah arrived next, carrying a bouquet of white lilies. "This house is ridiculous," she whispered, grinning. "In the best possible way." One by one, the guests filled the mansion. Kevin and his boyfriend brought guitars, their faces flushed from the cold. Mrs. Patterson appeared in her finest wool coat, holding a bottle of red wine wrapped in a silk scarf. "I haven't worn this dress in 20 years, she said shyly, and I hugged her tighter than I meant to. The room filled with music and chatter. Glasses clinked, laughter bloomed, and for the first time my house didn't feel too big. Every sound, every smile, every flash of light made it feel perfectly full. Dinner began just after 6. The table stretched across the dining room, candles flickering between garlands of pine and gold ornaments. The turkey gleamed under the chandelier, surrounded by sides that looked like something out of a food magazine. When everyone sat down, I took a deep breath, looked around the table, and realized this was what belonging looked like: faces that glowed with warmth instead of judgment. "To Lena," Maggie said, lifting her glass, "for reminding us that home isn't a place, it's the people who make you feel seen." Everyone cheered, glasses raised. I blinked hard, forcing back tears. "To second chances," I said, "and to all of you who made mine possible." As dinner went on, conversations spilled like wine. Jessica told stories about her twin boys and her new job at the library. Kevin made everyone laugh so hard they nearly cried, confessing how he burned his first batch of Christmas cookies trying to impress his boyfriend. Mrs. Patterson shared tales from her youth about dances in New York ballrooms and how she met her husband under falling snow. Halfway through dessert, the jazz trio shifted to a slow, romantic tune. Kevin stood up with his guitar and began to sing, his voice smooth and rich. Emma ran to the center of the room, twirling in her red velvet dress. Jack followed, tripping over his own shoes, and the guests clapped in rhythm. Maggie, laughing, pulled Mrs. Patterson to her feet, and soon the entire room was dancing. I stood by the fireplace for a moment, just watching. The firelight shimmered against the gold decorations, the tree glowing brighter than ever. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like freedom. Then someone called out, "Lena, come dance," I laughed. "I don't dance." "You do tonight," Sarah said, grabbing my hand. So I did. I danced. I spun under the lights with my children, with Maggie, with laughter all around me. The photographer I'd hired caught every moment, Emma's curls flying as she spun, Kevin dipping his boyfriend dramatically, me laughing mid-step with my arms thrown wide. When the flash went off, I looked up and saw my reflection in the glass of the window, a woman surrounded by joy, standing exactly where she belonged. After dinner, when the music softened and the plates were cleared, everyone gathered near the fireplace with cups of cocoa and wine. The air hummed with peace, the kind that only comes when no one has to pretend. I caught Maggie watching me, her eyes bright. "What?" I asked, smiling. "Nothing," she said. "You just look home." That word hit me harder than I expected. I nodded. "Yeah, I think I finally am." When the last guests began to leave, snow was falling again, thick and silent. I stood on the porch, hugging each of them goodbye as their cars disappeared down the long drive. Mrs. Patterson kissed my cheek. "You made this old lady's Christmas," she whispered. "You made mine," I said. Inside, the house was still glowing. Maggie helped gather the last of the glasses while the kids dozed on the couch under a blanket. I turned on the small lamp by the piano and sat down with my laptop. The photographer had already uploaded the photos, hundreds of them, glowing with color and warmth. Maggie leaned over my shoulder. "They're beautiful. You should share them. Let the world see what healing looks like." So I did. I selected a dozen and posted them online with a caption that came to me as easily as breath. "A Christmas for those who believed in second chances." For a moment, nothing happened. Then notifications began to light up the screen, hearts, comments, messages. "You look radiant. What a beautiful home. This is what Christmas should feel like." Then one notification made me freeze. New message from Mom. Maggie noticed. "You going to read it?" "Not tonight," I said, closing the laptop. I stood and walked to the window. The night outside was calm, the valley below glowing faintly in the moonlight. Inside, the tree shimmered gold, its reflection flickering across the glass. I took a deep breath and whispered, "They cut me off to keep their image spotless. But sometimes the best revenge is letting your joy be seen." Maggie appeared beside me with 2 mugs of cocoa. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." "Merry Christmas," I said softly, "to all of us who finally made it home." She smiled and slipped an arm around my shoulder. Behind us, the fire burned low, the music faded, and the camera light blinked once more before turning off. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, steady, endless. The house glowed against the darkness, a single warm light in the cold. And standing there, wrapped in peace, I knew I'd done it. Not revenge by destruction, but by living beautifully. By choosing joy loud enough for the whole world to hear. The morning after Christmas felt like waking up inside a dream I didn't want to end. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater and the soft rustle of wrapping paper left on the floor. I could still smell cinnamon and roasted turkey in the air. Emma and Jack were sprawled on the living room rug, surrounded by toys and ribbons, while Maggie hummed to herself in the kitchen, making coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I stretched sore from dancing and smiled at the sight of them. The tree still glowed faintly in the early light gold ornaments catching the sunrise. I reached for my phone to check the time and froze when I saw the screen. Notifications. Hundreds of them. Likes, shares, messages, and tags. I blinked half asleep before realizing what I was looking at: my Christmas post. I hadn't meant for it to be anything special. Just a few photos, the tree, the dinner table, the guests smiling Maggie, and the kids dancing by the fire. The caption had been simple: a Christmas for those who believed in second chances. But somehow it had taken on a life of its own. "Oh my God," I whispered. Maggie looked over, wiping her hands on a towel. "What? Apparently we went viral," she laughed. "What did you do now, sweetheart?" "Nothing. I think the internet just really likes golden Christmas trees." By noon the post had been shared thousands of times. The local Aspen paper picked it up under the headline, "A single mom's Christmas of second chances melts hearts." Comments poured in from strangers. "You gave me hope. This made me cry in the best way. Thank you for showing what real family looks like." I scrolled through them in disbelief. "I didn't post them for attention," I said quietly. But somehow the world found my piece worth looking at. Maggie poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one in front of me. "People can smell authenticity, honey. And they're starving for it." The day passed in a blur of phone pings and laughter. Every time I refreshed the page, there were more messages: old friends from college, people from the art center, even strangers sending photos of their own trees with the hashtag number Second Chance Christmas. It was overwhelming, but in the best way. Then, around 5, the texts started. The first came from a number I hadn't seen in months. "Daniel Carter, niece house. Guess you've been busy." I didn't respond. 10 minutes later, "Mom, we need to talk." I put the phone face down on the counter. Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Trouble." "Just the ghosts of Christmas past," I said. Unbeknownst to me, the same post that had filled my house with warmth was setting off small explosions elsewhere. Back in Denver, my mother's phone was ringing non-stop. Her friends from church had seen the article and wanted details. "Is that your daughter's mansion?" I thought she was struggling. Carol Carter, queen of composure, smiled through tight lips and said she's managing. But the gossip spread faster than she could control it. My brother Daniel was furious. "She's embarrassing us again," he told her, making everything public. My father sat quietly at his desk, scrolling through the comments himself. One line in particular caught his eye: "I wish my parents had supported me like she supports her kids." He didn't say it aloud, but it lingered sharp as glass. Meanwhile, my mother stared at the photos on her tablet, me in the emerald dress, smiling beside Emma and Jack, surrounded by people who looked genuinely happy. She zoomed in, her fingers trembling slightly. "This can't be real," she thought. "She doesn't live like this." But the golden tree, the feast, the faces, it was undeniable. That evening, my phone rang again. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hey," he said, his voice tight. "Mom's upset." "I'm not surprised. You could have at least told us you were planning some production." "She feels blindsided." "Blindsided," I repeated. "You mean like how I felt when I was uninvited from Christmas dinner?" He sighed. "That's not the same." "You're right," I said. "This one had joy." There was silence. Then he muttered, "You really know how to make everything about you." Maybe because for once it was about me. I hung up before he could answer. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from my sister-in-law, one of those carefully curated women who spoke only in half-truths and exclamation points. "We should catch up soon. Your photos looked amazing. So proud of you," I laughed out loud. "So proud," I repeated, rolling my eyes. That's rich. But the call I knew was coming arrived just after sunset. My mother. I let it ring once before answering. "Lena," she began, her voice sharp and trembling. "Do you have any idea what kind of chaos you've caused? My phone hasn't stopped ringing." "People think we abandoned you." I looked out the window at the falling snow. "You did. You just didn't expect the world to notice." "Don't be cruel," she said. "We were trying to protect you. Protect the family's reputation." "And I was protecting my children," I said calmly. "Looks like one of us succeeded." There was a pause long enough to hear her breathing. "You've changed," she said finally, almost like an accusation. "That's the point, Mom." When I hung up, I felt no anger, no satisfaction, just relief. The kind that comes when you finally stop expecting someone to see you clearly. That night after the kids went to bed, I sat by the window with a blanket and a cup of tea. The valley below was silent, the world hushed under layers of snow. The lights from the town twinkled faintly in the distance. My phone buzzed again, but this time the name on the screen made me laugh softly. An editor from Aspen Living magazine. "Miss Carter," the message read, "we'd love to feature your story in our upcoming issue on resilience. Are you available for an interview?" I took a sip of tea and set the phone down. Outside, the wind carried faint notes of laughter from somewhere down the hill. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to be invisible, trying to fit into the quiet boxes my family built for me. And now here I was, visible, loud, in the best way, my happiness impossible to ignore. The next morning I woke to find the article had been shared by the magazine's official page. Aspen woman's story of rebuilding family after betrayal inspires thousands. My inbox was flooded again, messages from people telling me how my story made them feel, seen people who had been cut off, dismissed, silenced. Maggie handed me coffee and said, "You realize you've become a symbol, right?" I laughed. A symbol of what? Of surviving beautifully. I looked around the living room, the messy pile of wrapping paper, the half-empty mugs, the golden tree still shining. I smiled. I'll take that. That evening, as twilight settled, I stepped outside. The snow was falling again, slow and quiet. The house glowed behind me, light spilling from every window. My phone buzzed one last time, another interview request, but I ignored it. I didn't need validation anymore. I whispered to the night. They built their image on perfection. I built mine on truth. Turns out truth photographs better. Inside, Emma and Jack's laughter drifted through the walls, the sweetest sound in the world. I closed the door, letting the warmth wrap around me. The storm outside was theirs now. Mine was the light that stayed. It started with the flowers. A white box on the doorstep wrapped in gold ribbon, the kind you only see in catalogs. The card was signed, "Thinking of you, Carol." No message, no apology. Just her name, neat and proud, like nothing had happened. I stared at it for a long time before bringing it inside. Maggie spotted it first. "Well," she said, setting down her mug, "looks like the ghosts are trying to get back into the house." I laughed, but my chest tightened. They must have heard the living are doing fine without them. For a few days it continued, flowers, handwritten notes, missed calls from my brother. Someone even mailed a tin of cookies with my mother's handwriting on the tag. Every attempt felt rehearsed, like a PR campaign. Then one afternoon the inevitable happened. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there stood Daniel, my older brother, holding a box of pastries and a look that didn't quite fit his face. "You've really outdone yourself, Lena," he said, stepping inside without waiting. "This place is impressive." "Thanks," I said. "It's nice to finally have room for people who actually want to visit." He ignored that. "Mom's been miserable. She misses you. You should visit. It's time." "Time for what?" "For forgiveness," he said, simply, like it was a favor I owed. I walked to the counter, poured 2 cups of coffee, and handed him one. She missed me when she had a full table and still left 2 chairs empty, I said quietly. Daniel sighed. You know how she is. She panics about appearances. It wasn't personal. Not personal, I repeated. You mean when she uninvited her own daughter from Christmas because my divorce was inconvenient? He shifted uncomfortably. You're being dramatic. No, I said, voice steady. I'm being specific. He smiled weakly, the way people do when they realize the script isn't working. You've changed, he said finally. I had to. Staying the same wasn't working. He left the pastries on the counter and mumbled something about seeing me soon. When the door closed behind him, the silence felt heavier than before. I didn't open the box. 3 days later, it happened again. This time it wasn't a note or a call. It was the sound of tires crunching against snow and a car door slamming outside. Through the window I saw her, my mother wrapped in a fur coat, her hair perfect, her expression unreadable. Maggie appeared behind me, drying her hands on a towel. Want me to handle this one? No, I said. I think it's my turn. When I opened the door, the cold rushed in. She stood there holding a small gift bag. I didn't come to argue, she said quickly. I didn't say you did. May I come in? I hesitated. For a moment, I considered saying no, but I stepped aside. 5 minutes, I said. She walked in like someone entering a museum, careful not to touch anything. Her eyes swept the room, the fireplace, the photographs on the mantel, the golden tree still glowing softly in the corner. This is lovely, she said finally. You always had taste. Maybe you got that from me. I smiled faintly. Maybe. Everyone's talking about you, Lena. You're quite the success story. You mean the story where I survived your silence? Her face stiffened. That's not fair. No, I said softly. But it's true. She set the gift bag down on the table. I just want my family back, she said, voice trembling. I've missed you. I've missed the children. I looked at her carefully. No, I said. You want your reputation back. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. You think that's all this is? I think you're used to control. And I think losing it feels a lot like losing love to you. She looked away, blinking hard. You don't understand how hard it's been for me hearing what people say, Mom. I interrupted. I know fear. I lived in it for years. But you used fear as an excuse for cruelty. You could have chosen compassion. You didn't. Her voice cracked. I made mistakes. You made decisions, I said. Mistakes can be forgiven. Decisions have consequences. She looked smaller. Then her posture softening, shoulders drooping under the weight of her coat. I'm sorry, she said, almost whispering. I just wanted things to go back to normal. There's no back, Mom. There's only forward. Her eyes filled, but I didn't move toward her. I forgive you, I said, and her face lit up for a fraction of a second before I added. But forgiveness doesn't mean you get to come inside. Her smile froze. What this house isn't built on guilt. You don't get to use regret as a ticket in. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of wind outside filled the space between us. Then she nodded slowly, her chin trembling. You've become very cold. No, I said quietly. I've become clear. I opened the door. The wind howled through, lifting her hair. She hesitated, staring at me like she was searching for the little girl who used to chase her approval, but that girl was gone. She stepped outside. You'll regret this one day. I smiled. You already did. Then I closed the door. I stood there, hands shaking not from sadness, but from release. For years I had imagined this conversation, ending with her hugging me, apologizing, finally saying the words I'd needed to hear. But standing there in the quiet, I realized I didn't need them anymore. Maggie peeked out from the kitchen. You okay? Yeah, I said, exhaling. She came for her dignity, not for me, but I'm glad she got to see mine. We watched through the window as my mother's car pulled away, the tires carving deep lines in the snow. Within minutes, flakes began to fall again, covering the tracks like it never happened. That night, after the kids went to bed, I sat at my desk and opened my journal. The words came easily. I used to think peace meant silence. Now I know it means boundaries. I wrote until my hand cramped, then folded a sheet of paper and slid it into an envelope addressed to Mom. I didn't plan to send it. I just needed to say it. You raised me to care what people think, but I learned to care what I feel. I placed the letter in the drawer and turned off the lamp. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Outside, the snowfall thickened, erasing the last signs of her visit. I stood by the window watching, as the world turned white, the past, fading under a fresh layer of peace. The storm always ends, but sometimes you have to be the one who closes the door. For a week after my mother's visit, the house felt quieter than usual. Not empty, just still like the air after a storm. The kids went back to school. Maggie spent her mornings reading by the fire, and I painted in the studio with the mountains framed in the window. There was peace, but a fragile kind. It hummed in the background as if life was catching its breath. "Feels like things are finally settling," Maggie said one afternoon, stirring sugar into her tea. "Quiet doesn't mean finished," I said. She gave me a look. "You expecting ghosts again?" I smiled faintly. "The past has a way of knocking when you least expect it." 2 days later, the phone rang while I was sketching. It was Patricia Lang. I hadn't spoken to her in months. "Lena," she said, her voice brisk but gentle, "you should know Mark's out." Conditional release. I froze. Not fear, just surprise. "Already good behavior, cooperation with investigators," she said. "He's lost everything, his license, his practice, his house. I doubt he'll bother you, but I thought you should hear it from me." For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I looked around the studio, the warmth, the quiet, the smell of turpentine and pine. "Thank you, Patricia," I said. "But I'm not afraid of him anymore." "I know," she said softly. "That's why I called." After we hung up, I stood by the window, staring out at the snow falling in slow spirals. Mark free but ruined. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like gravity, inevitable, just natural. He once told me I'd fall apart without his name. Now he was the one without a place to stand. 3 days later, it happened. I was driving back from dropping the kids off at school when I saw a beat-up sedan parked at the end of my driveway. My pulse quickened, but not from fear. I knew that car. He was standing outside, hands shoved in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold air. I pulled over, slowly rolled down the window halfway. "Lena," he said, voice hoarse, "I didn't come for money. I just wanted to say sorry." I didn't answer. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched, the arrogance drained from him. There were lines around his eyes I didn't remember. "You've built something beautiful," he said, finally, glancing toward the house. "You destroyed something beautiful first," I replied. He nodded as if he expected that. "I don't have an excuse. I thought I was untouchable. I thought," his voice cracked, "you were right about everything." I stepped out of the car but stayed near the door. "I didn't come out here for your confession, Mark. Whatever peace you're looking for, you'll have to make it yourself." He swallowed hard. "I know. I just wanted you to hear it from me. I'm sorry." There was a time those words would have undone me. Now they just floated in the cold air, weightless. He looked up again. "Tell the kids I'm sorry too. They'll know," I said, "when they see who I became." He nodded once, then turned back toward his car. For a moment I almost pitied him. But pity is not the same as forgiveness. It's just distance wearing kindness's face. When I got home, Maggie was waiting in the kitchen. She didn't ask, just handed me a mug of tea. "So, the ghost visited," I said, "and left." "Good," she said. "You don't need hauntings in a house this pretty." That night, as I tucked the kids in, Emma asked, "Mom, is Dad still bad?" I thought for a moment. "No," I said. "Just lost." She nodded sleepily. "Then maybe he'll find a new map." "Maybe," I whispered. A week later, another car pulled into the drive. This one I didn't recognize right away. It was Daniel. He stepped out, holding a cardboard box, snow sticking to his coat. "I brought something for you," he said. Awkward. Inside were photo albums, old family pictures, my childhood sketchbooks, drawings I'd forgotten existed. "Mom wanted you to have these," he said quietly. She's been different lately. "Different how she's quiet," he said. "I think she finally realizes what she did." I ran my hand over one of the albums. "Regret's a strange teacher," I said. "She doesn't know how to say sorry," he admitted. "Neither do I really." "You just did," I said. He smiled faintly. "You were right, Lena. You didn't need us to be strong. We needed you to remember how." For the first time in years, I believed him. When he left, I stood at the window watching his car drive away. It struck me that closure didn't come with grand gestures or apologies shouted through tears. Sometimes it came quietly in the shape of an old box handed over on a snowy day. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I carried the albums into my studio. The room smelled of oil paint and lavender candles. I flipped through the pages, photos of birthdays, summers, by the lake, drawings of trees and faces I'd long stopped thinking about. I paused at one sketch I'd made at 16, a woman standing under a winter sky, hair blown by the wind, her hands outstretched toward falling snow. I smiled. "I guess I always knew how to survive," I whispered. I pulled out my notebook and began to write. "Forgiveness is the art of seeing clearly without needing to forget." The words came easily, like they'd been waiting all along. Maggie appeared in the doorway, her robe wrapped around her. "You're still up," she said. "Couldn't sleep." She looked at the sketch on the table. "If they all came back tomorrow, your mother, your brother, even him, would you let them in?" I thought about it for a long moment, then closed the notebook. "Maybe," I said, "but not into my house, into my peace." She smiled. "That's enough." I walked her to the hallway and watched as she disappeared into her room. Outside, the snow was falling again, the same soft rhythm it had every night that winter. I turned off the lights and stood by the window one last time. In the distance, Aspen was a sea of gold against the dark. The world felt wide again, open. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the story wasn't about punishment anymore. Karma hadn't come to destroy them. It had come to teach them. And I was finally free enough to watch it happen without hate, without fear, and without needing to be right. The snow fell thicker, covering the tracks on the driveway, until the world was clean again. For the first time in my life, peace didn't feel like surrender. It felt like home. The first morning of the new year was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a blessing. The snow outside had begun to melt, and sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, turning the frost on the glass into diamonds. The air smelled like coffee and cinnamon, and the house hummed softly with life. Emma chasing Jack down the hallway, Maggie singing along to an old Ella Fitzgerald record while flipping pancakes. I sat by the window wrapped in a blanket, my journal open on my lap. The last page was still blank. I wrote slowly, the pen scratching softly across the paper. 1 year ago, I lost everything I thought defined me. Now I have everything that matters. I closed the notebook and looked out at the valley. The mountains were shining their peaks pink with dawn. The kind of beauty that makes you believe in second chances. "Mommy, come eat before Jack takes all the strawberries," Emma shouted. I laughed, tucking the blanket tighter around my shoulders. "Be there in a minute after breakfast." I checked my emails, half expecting bills or spam. Instead, one subject line caught my eye. Feature invitation. Women who rebuilt. I opened it, heart pounding just a little. The message was from a small media company that produced short documentaries about resilience. They'd seen my story online and wanted to include me in their upcoming special. "Your journey represents strength, grace, and the power of healing," it said. I leaned back in my chair, unsure how to feel. Sharing my life with the world had already brought enough noise, enough opinions. Did I really want to open it all up again? Maggie noticed the look on my face. "What's that?" I handed her my phone. She read, eyebrows lifting. "Well, look at that. The world's not done listening to you yet." "I don't know," I said. "I've spent so long closing doors. Do I really want to open one again?" She smiled knowingly. You've spent a year proving who you are. Maybe it's time to let others see what strength actually looks like. She was right as usual. So I said yes. 2 weeks later, a small crew arrived in Aspen. They set up cameras in the living room, the same one that had once been filled with laughter and golden lights on Christmas Eve. The house looked different now, less glamorous, more lived in. There were toys on the rug, a stack of sketchbooks on the coffee table, Maggie's tea mug forgotten by the window. But it felt right. The interviewer, a woman in her 30s, with kind eyes, adjusted her microphone and smiled. "We'll just talk," she said. "No script. Just your story." When the camera's red light blinked on, I took a deep breath. She started with the easy questions, what I'd learned about rebuilding, what advice I'd give to someone starting over. Then she asked, if you could say one thing to the people who hurt you, what would it be? I thought about it for a moment, then smiled. Thank you, because without you, I might never have found myself. Her eyes softened. And what does revenge mean to you now? It's not about making others suffer, I said. It's about living so fully that they can't hurt you anymore. It's about building something so bright they can't help but see it. There was a pause, the kind that feels like the air is holding its breath. The interviewer nodded slowly. That's beautiful, she said. When they finished, the crew packed up quietly. The director hugged me before she left. You have no idea how many people will need to hear this, she said. That evening, I sat by the fire watching the last light fade from the mountains. My phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unfamiliar number, but the name stopped me cold. Mom. I hesitated before opening it. The message was short, just one line. I saw the interview. I was wrong. You've become everything I wanted to be, but was too afraid to try. I read it twice, then folded the phone shut. No anger, no tears. Just a strange, quiet gratitude. I slipped the phone into my pocket and stared at the fire. Maybe this was what forgiveness really looked like, not erasing the past, but finally seeing it clearly and feeling nothing but peace. The next morning, I found a small envelope in the mailbox addressed in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a photograph of me as a child standing beside her at a park. On the back, she'd written, "You always had light in you. I'm sorry I tried to dim it." I placed it next to the family photo on the mantel. The circle didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to close. That night, as the snow melted into streams along the driveway, the kids and I went out to the porch. The air was crisp and smelled of pine. We wrapped ourselves in blankets and watched the stars appear one by one. Emma leaned her head on my shoulder. "Mommy," she said softly, "are we happy now?" I looked at her, at Jack, curled up beside us, at Maggie, humming quietly through the open window. The sound of life, warm and simple. "We're free, sweetheart," I said. "Happiness comes with that." She smiled, eyes heavy with sleep, and I kissed her forehead. The wind stirred through the trees, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the town below. I thought about everything, the betrayals, the heartbreak, the endless nights I'd believed I wouldn't make it through. And yet here I was, whole. As the kids drifted off beside me, I whispered to the night. They taught me that love could be conditional. Life taught me that peace never is. I stood for a moment longer, looking out at the mountains bathed in silver moonlight. The house behind me glowed softly, not with the shine of luxury, but with something far better, contentment. When I went back inside, the fire had burned low. I added one last log, watched it catch, and sat for a while longer, listening to the crackle. My reflection shimmered faintly in the window, overlapping with the snowy landscape beyond. 1 year ago, I'd been shut out of a family dinner because my existence didn't fit their idea of perfection. Now I'd built a life where I didn't need an invitation to belong. The world outside was quiet again, the kind of quiet that means peace has finally found a home. And as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I realized something simple but absolute. The best revenge was never the feast or the photos or the fame. It was this: waking up every morning in a life built from truth, surrounded by love that asked for nothing in return. And in that truth, I found everything worth keeping.